Awesome.
All right. Take it away, Olivia. Let's learn
Uh,
about morphology and
Thank you,
syntax.
Anna. Yes, it is about to get very nerdy. This is one of my all-time favorite topics. Let me go ahead and share my screen, just to make sure you can all see what I'm looking at. So hopefully you can see an introduction to morphology and syntax. Amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a slideshow. Are you seeing the full screen now? Excellent. All right. Well, welcome to this installment of the webinar series where we're talking about morphology and syntax and how all of that relates to language documentation and revitalization. Got to give some credit to the makers of these slides, my colleague Anu, and the Language Documentation Training Center, which is an organization I work for here at my university. I had the pleasure of talking to you all a couple of weeks ago about audio and video recording tools, but I'm just going to very quickly remind you who I am. A little bit distorted there, but this is me. I'm Olivia. I'm a PhD student at University of Hawaii. So this is where I spend most of my days, not in the ocean. The dot got moved a little bit. Sorry about that. I am indeed in Honolulu. And I do most of my linguistic work in Alaska and in India at the moment. All right. So today we're going to start by talking about morphology. And the very first question that I'm going to pose for you is a question that sounds incredibly easy and straightforward, feels like a question that students in kindergarten should be able to reliably answer. But in fact, it is a very complicated question in linguistics. So the question is, what is a word? And if you sit down and you really try to define what a word is, you may come up with some ideas. Your ideas may be based on orthography, right, which my colleague Nathan talked about last week, right? You may think of a word as anything that has spaces around it when it's written down. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it actually varies considerably by language. So here is a Welsh word that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, but that is all one word in the Welsh language. A word that you might be familiar with from English is karaoke singers. However, that is actually pulling the word karaoke from Japanese and the word singers from English to create a brand new word representing a new meaning, karaoke singers, and sometimes represented with a hyphen there. And then you have the shortest possible word, which is just a single letter, in English, right? So all of these are technically words, but they are very, very different from one another and subscribe to different criteria of what constitutes a word. Here, by the way, I have the translation of this Welsh word for you. And it would be as if you said all of these English words and smushed them all into one single word. So what you'll find as you're analyzing language, as you're translating between languages, is that what constitutes one word in Welsh is actually something like 20 words in English. So it's not a clear-cut linguistic phenomenon. What is a little easier to talk about is the idea of a morpheme. So morphology is the study of words and word structure in languages. And we're going to go ahead and define the word morpheme as the smallest meaningful constituent of linguistic expression. So a morpheme is a piece of language, so to speak, that carries with it some sort of semantic content, some sort of meaning, and you cannot break it down any further. I used to be a chemistry teacher, so I like to think of morphemes as like the atoms, right, of the linguistics world. You can combine them to make molecules, but you can't get any smaller than the atom. And someone's going to talk to me about electrons, and that ruins my entire premise here. So we're going to think about morphemes as the smallest units of linguistic meaning. We've got two basic types. One is a root, which is a morpheme that can stand on its own in a language, serving as a word in its own right. An affix is a morpheme that has to be attached to some other morpheme, to a root, for example, in order for it to be grammatical. So we'll talk more about each of those types. Affixes are bound morphemes, as I said. They cannot occur alone. And when you take a word in English and you start to strip away all the affixes, all the little pieces that give meaning but can't stand on their own, that's how you reconstruct the root, so to speak. So I think all of this is best understood with examples. So the word apples, right? The root of that plural word is just apple, right? You can't break apple down any further. I don't know what a lul is in English, right? It doesn't have any meaning alone. AP, also no meaning in English. So apple is that smallest discrete unit that has a specific meaning, the lovely red fruit that you eat. And then you can attach the affix, the S affix, right? Which pluralizes the root of apple. Similarly, teach. I cannot break teach down any further and still maintain some semblance of English meaning. So teach is my root. And then I can add more affixes to that root to convey other meanings, like one who teaches. Or there's near, right? Near is that fundamental unit of meaning closest to me. And I can start qualifying that by saying something is nearer or the nearest. And that again is adding affixes. Notice again that these affixes cannot stand alone. So I could not just say in the middle of an English sentence. That would not be grammatical. So here at the bottom is famously the longest word in English, anti-disestablishmentarianism. And if you really dig down and strip away each affix one at a time, what you'll find is the root, the word that can stand alone, the smallest unit of meaning, is establish. And then we go ahead and we add prefixes and we add suffixes to keep generating different shades of meaning. But all of it boils down to that root of establish. So morphology is really about adding affixes to your roots to accomplish different things in a language. Very quickly, I'll give you sort of a typology of affixes. So prefixes, very self-explanatory. They occur before the root, pre, right? So we have redo, pre-plan, demystify. These are affixes that have to come before the root to which they are bound. Suffixes, similarly, have to come after. So when we form adverbs in English, we add ly to things, quickly. If we said "li quick," no one would understand what we were saying because "li" is a suffix. English doesn't really have these. Some examples could be made perhaps, but circumfixes occur in many languages of the world. As circum implies, these are affixes that actually go around the word. So you'll have one in front and one at the end of the word. So in French, you negate something, you negate a verb by putting ne before it and pas after it, je ne veux pas. So you can think of the ne pas affix as being a circumfix, as surrounding the root there, which means to want. And then infixes, again, very rare in English, very common in some other parts of the world. So infixes are actually where you insert an affix in the middle of the root. So whereas you started out with the root bili, meaning to buy in Tagalog, for example, you might insert an infix, binili, so you insert that in infix to represent that action occurred in the past. And certain languages which use templatic morphology. So for example, in Arabic, you have this lovely triconsonantal root, K, T, and B. And as you change and modify the vowels that come between these consonants, so essentially as you alter the infixes, you change the meanings of those words. So kitab, for example, is book, and aktub is be writing. So all those infixes are changing a little bit, and that helps lend different shades of meaning to your words. Morphology is a really interesting phenomenon in that you can use morphological processes to change your words. So we use what are called derivational affixes to build a word that has a different meaning that is distinct from the root that we started out with. You could also call it a base. There are a bunch of different terms here that are used somewhat interchangeably by linguists. So for example, sell, right? Sell, again, our smallest unit of meaning that means to exchange money for a product. You can't break it down anymore. Se doesn't really mean anything, nor does lul. So you've got your word sell, your root. And now if I start adding derivational affixes, I can arrive at brand new words, and these words might be totally different parts of speech. So we had the verb sell, and we created the noun, the derived noun seller, meaning some person who performs that selling operation. So I was able to convey so much more meaning just with this tiny little suffix that I added here. And that suffix is very productive. You can use it for all sorts of words, like the word write, which becomes writer. Or I'm sure you can think of many, teach, teacher, right? That suffix conveys the person doing this action. You can start with a verb and use derivational morphology to get another verb, right? We have our verb do, and you can redo something. You can undo something. So there you go with being able to modify the meaning of that specific verb, make a new one. You can start with an adjective and get a noun. For example, we'll start with happy, and you can derive unhappy, which is another adjective, right? Or you can go even further and say unhappiness. So by adding these prefixes and suffixes, we've now totally changed the meaning of our word. Similarly with bright, we can create bright or brightness. This is a typo, the state of being bright. So in essence, you have the option to kind of play around, plop affixes this way and that on your words, generate new types of meaning. And it's quite fun. People take poetic license with this quite a bit in different languages. So sometimes people make up words that perhaps aren't part of the lexicon. You might not find them in a dictionary, but you know what they mean because you are familiar with the derivational processes. We also have conversion is another word changing process, which is where you don't actually add any affixes, but you actually, you take an existing word and you assign a new syntactic category to it. So for example, we think of the word ink as being a noun, right? The ink that's in my pen, but it can be used in English as a verb. I'm going to go ahead and ink this contract. I'm going to put the ink on it and therefore sign it. Run, typically a verb, but it can also be a noun. I go on a run, right? Or if you have the adjective dirty, I can then make that into a verb. I am going to dirty the car, or the shirt, or something. So there's this fluidity between parts of speech that is a function of conversion between different parts of speech. Compounding, another common morphological process where you can create brand new units of meaning just by smooshing different words together. So fire and engine, two very discrete entities, become fire engine, which has one distinct meaning independent of its parts. Nationwide, spoon feed, steamroll, all these different things. And remember, we started this conversation talking about how difficult it is to define a word. And you can actually see that represented here in the orthography, right? Sometimes we separate these two components, even though fire engine is something very different from both a fire and an engine. Sometimes we remove all spaces, right? A greenhouse becomes one thing. Or we add a hyphen, a dash here. So even native English speakers are a little bit divided on how to represent compound words in English. That's why this notion of a word is really tough to wrap our minds around, tough to pin down. So we're going to steer clear of talking about words and talk more about morphemes. Another really interesting process that you might encounter in some languages you work with is reduplication. And this is where you form new words by repeating part or all of the root or of the stem. So you will find in Tagalog, again, that example, bili, to buy. And if I go ahead and take that first syllable of the root and duplicate it, you'll get bibili, which now means I will buy in the future. Another example from where I live is in Hawaiian. Ula means red. And if I want to convey to you that something is really, really very red, I'll say ula ula. So the reduplication of that root conveys an intensity. And reduplication has all sorts of functions. It can have diminutive meanings. It can have repetitive meanings. It can do all sorts of things in different languages. In English, this was just pointed out to me recently. I used to think we didn't have reduplication in English, but we do, because you can say something like, oh, do you like her or do you like her, right? And that second one, that reduplicated one, like, conveys that you really like this person. So there's an intensity that's conveyed via reduplication. So keep an eye out for that in your, as you examine your languages. Another very, very important aspect of morphology is inflection. So inflection isn't necessarily creating a word with a brand new meaning or a brand new category, part of speech. It's adding additional grammatical information to a word. And we'll talk about this a little more later, but the grammatical information can be wide-ranging. It can be, information about how many people are involved, the genders of the people involved, whether it's happening now or in the past or in the future or continuously. All of these little bits of information can be conveyed by adding what are called inflectional morphemes or inflectional affixes to your words. So an example in English would be, I am sitting right now at a singular desk, but perhaps I'm surrounded by desks. So adding that extra morpheme to the end of the word desk conveys to the speaker, that now there are more than one. So that's an inflectional morpheme that indicates plurality. That same morpheme, for better or for worse, that S can also convey the fact that something is happening in the present in English. So if I say she speaks now, right? I took my root word speak and I added this to the end of it. And now that's telling me that the speaking is occurring in the present. It's ongoing. And so just be a little bit careful, right? Because sometimes you'll have a single morpheme that can form or perform multiple functions, such as pluralizing or present tense, so to speak. In German, for example, if I want to pluralize the word for cat, Katze, I'll add an N to it, so it'll become Katzen, or Hunde, Hunden for dog, right? So these, they're not changing the meaning of the word by any means. They're adding more information about it. They're telling me that it's not just one cat over there, it's lots of cats. So inflectional morphology will end up being very, very important. As linguists, we need a way to keep track of all of this, because when you are starting to work with a language and you ask a speaker, how do I say 3 cats are sitting over there, right? You're gonna be met with a string of language, and you have to organize that language somehow. You have to understand what every little component of that sentence is actually doing in the language to convey that piece of meaning. And the way we do that as linguists is via glossing. Sometimes it's called interlinear glossing. And we typically use this set of conventions that was established a while back. They're called the Leipzig glossing rules. So after this presentation, I'll happily send a link to those glossing rules for you, or you can feel free to Google them. But they just give a sort of a standard protocol for how to convey linguistic information about a word or a sentence to other linguists. So for example, I have some Tagalog here that's been glossed. You will start out with the Tagalog sentence. So if you asked your Tagalog informant to say, I ate the fish, they would say this. And then you as the linguist would go through and gloss each individual morpheme that you find. So for example, the K-A-I-N morpheme, I'm not going to try to pronounce Tagalog because I do not speak it, so I don't want to mess up. But K means eat in Tagalog. And then we have an infix, which is represented with these little brackets, which is described by linguists as PFV. That means perfective. And again, we can talk a little more about all of these abbreviations. There's many of them. As you proceed with your linguistic studies, you will be introduced to more and more, and they're all listed in the Leipzig glossing rules. But perfective tells us that the action is completed. And then you go on to your next morpheme. This is the ko morpheme. And this is telling you that it's the first person singular, so that's I. And this is giving you a little bit more information, grammatical information, which we can talk about later. We have another morpheme here, which is representing more grammatical information, absolute of case, and then ista gives us fish. So this is a complicated example, but what we've done is we've teased apart every single morpheme, so every single discrete unit of meaning, and we've basically translated or assigned that meaning to it, so that a linguist can later look back and say, oh, that's right. In order to express the perfective meaning in Tagalog, I need to use this infix. We'll try now a slightly easier version. We can go ahead and do this in English as well. And just to give you a little bit of context for how the process goes, if I give you the word dogs, for example, you will break that down into two morphemes, right? The root, which just means dog, and then that pluralizing morpheme s. And the way we're going to gloss this, according to the Leipzig conventions, is we're going to just translate the morphemes we can translate, so dog, and then we know the s morpheme means plural. So we're going to go ahead and put this capital PL. And now if we treat the verb, we say the dog barked, for example. Bark is our root. Can't break it down any further. When you add that ed suffix, you get the past tense form of bark. So we're going to gloss that with PST, meaning past. There are, standardized ways to represent all these different grammatical meanings. And you'll get used to them as you keep working with them. So if we were to perform interlinear glossing in English, which you can absolutely do because English does have morphology, not super complex morphology, but it's there. We would go ahead and we would separate out every single morpheme that we can find in our sentence. The dogs are barking at my friend. It's really just the words dogs and barking that have more than one morpheme. And then you'll go ahead and you'll translate those. So the is being translated here as a determiner, which is a part of speech that gives a little more information about a noun. Here's our plural dogs. Here is our verb meaning to be, and it's been inflected, it's been conjugated so that it's in the third person plural form. And that form happens to be are. So that's what this is telling you here. Barking, ing is a morpheme that tells you the action is ongoing. It's a progressive morpheme. And then again, you have the possessive pronoun my, which is saying it belongs to me, the first singular person, and it's possessive in nature. So notice how we've broken down every single morpheme in this sentence and are identifying exactly what those morphemes tell us. And this is what you need to do when you're documenting languages so that you can really, really pin down what each of those morphemes does in the sentence. I'm going to really quickly walk you through morphological typology, which is a broad overview of how different languages in the world treat morphology or how morphological processes tend to work in those languages. And we do tend to differentiate 4 types of morphological system. But I do want to caveat this by saying that this is a spectrum, right? You can't sort of discretely assign each language to a category or a type of morphology. It's really a continuum along which each language is situated. And the continuum goes from simpler morphology to more complex morphology. So we'll start out on the simple end of things, which are the isolating languages, also known as analytic. These languages steer clear of affixes for the most part. So anyone out there familiar with Mandarin or Cantonese, Vietnamese, Khmer, these languages tend to not have too much inflection, right? So whereas in English, we might have a past tense morpheme to represent that something happened in the past. In Mandarin, you're just going to add this little particle, the l particle, saying that something is complete. But you're not really going to add any more morphemes. You're not going to change too much about the structure of the words or the sentences. So again, it's sort of a simpler form of morphological processing here. Which isn't to say that the language is simple by any means, right? There's lots more going on in the language in terms of syntax and phonology, but morphologically speaking, it's relatively straightforward. Next, on our hierarchy of complexity, we're going to go to agglutinating languages. These languages love affixes. However, each affix typically expresses just one grammatical concept. So, for example, I do not speak Korean, so I will not will not attempt to pronounce this. But we're talking here about the professor, right? This is our word meaning the professor. And you'll notice when we split it up into morphemes, we've got professor, and then this nim morpheme means honorific. It means that the thing we're referring to is in has a high status in society. And then we've got this E morpheme, which tells us that this is the subject, right? So collectively, this tells us that the honorable professor, which is the subject of the sentence, and each morpheme corresponds to one piece of grammatical information. We can go to the verb now, where we find the root meaning leave. We find a morpheme, again, conveying honorific, a morpheme telling us that it's happening in the past tense, and a morpheme telling us this is declarative. This is a statement, not a question. So each morpheme assigns a different shade of meaning to the overall word. And other languages that fall into this category are Japanese, Turkish, very famously, Swahili, which I know some folks said they spoke in the chat. Fun languages, because it really does feel like a puzzle. It really feels like you're just kind of like adding little bits and pieces to a jigsaw puzzle. Now remember, we're increasing the complexity as we go up this hierarchy. So next are fusional languages. Also love affixes. The difference here is that affixes in fusional languages tend to express multiple pieces of grammatical information at the same time. So I'm going to go here to the Spanish example. She left, partió. So this is it should be leave, sorry. This is the word meaning to leave. And that O morpheme is conveying to us that it's a third person singular agent that's performing the action of leaving, and that it's happening in the past. So two very important pieces of grammatical information conveyed by a single morpheme. So if we were to change either of those things, right, if it were to happen either in the present, or maybe it's me doing the leaving and not her, we would have to use a different morpheme altogether. So here we have sort of a many-to-one relationship between grammatical information and morphemes. But again, very similar to the agglutinating languages, and languages will sometimes fall between those two spots on the spectrum, right? It's certainly not possible to assign a language entirely to one category as opposed to the other. This just gives you a taste of what languages can do with respect to affixes and morphology. And finally, the hardest of all, in many people's opinions, polysynthetic languages, in which single words consist of long strings of roots and affixes, and these are often translated into entire sentences in another language. Very common in the indigenous languages of North America. So we have Inuktitut here. And notice that this one single word is being broken down here into many morphemes, which indicate things like futurity, or past. Something is indicative, meaning it's a statement. A verb is intransitive. It's the third person singular person doing something. So all of these morphemes just basically get smushed together into one long word. And there's some sort of overlap in terms of what the affixes mean and how they relate to grammatical function. So these are very complicated, very fun to tease apart though, and to try to figure out what each morpheme is conveying. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly take a pause here to kind of appreciate all the different morphological possibilities that languages have, the way they use affixes to change word meanings or to convey subtle differences in meaning. And they can do so at the very simple end of the spectrum, really just using words with very few affixes, or they can go wild with affixes at the polysynthetic end of the spectrum. And you, as a documenter of a language, it is your job to kind of figure out where along that spectrum does my language lie. And towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you some tools, sort of a starting point for how to start investigating these things. Okay. Syntax is the study of phrases or sentences and their structure. So we are progressively building upon our study of language. Last week, you learned about sounds. Now we've expanded to sort of words and units of meaning. And now we're going to expressing entire thoughts. And the structure of those thoughts and how you put together those smaller units of meaning is syntax. A very important concept in syntax are parts of speech. And if you hearken back to your days in grade school, you'll probably remember learning about, what's a noun, it's a person, place, or thing, what's a verb, right? You can describe an adjective and so forth. Unfortunately, as you progress with your linguistic careers, you'll find that parts of speech is not as straightforward as our grade school teachers would have had us believe. And that's okay. But different languages actually have different parts of speech. Some languages, for example, express what we think of as adjectives in English. They will express those using verbs. So you can't take it for granted that every language has the exact same part of speech inventory as your own language. It's pretty well accepted that all languages have nouns and verbs, although there is even some discussion about that. There is some evidence to suggest that some languages might not have nouns, which is mind-blowing. Regardless, the way to tell what type of part of speech you have is encapsulated by this little sentence here, which is, you know a word by the company it keeps. You can figure out the part of speech based on the things that exist around that word. So I'll give you a little example. So nouns, as we've learned in grade school, they represent entities or concepts. And one way to tell what's a noun is the fact that it often occurs with what's called a determiner, which can specify or which express the specificity, right? If I say a cat, I can pick any of these three cats. Versus the cat, I'm specifically talking about this cat in the blue circle. I might say many cats, referring to all three. I might say this cat, because I'm pointing an arrow towards the one in the middle. So determiners just give me extra information about the word cat and about which specific cat I'm looking at. So if you see a word and it occurs next to a determiner, it's very likely that it's a noun. So that can help you out as you proceed with your language documentation. Verbs, we've all learned that verbs represent events, processes, states, and you'll know it's a verb if it occurs with markers of tense or aspect. Tense tells you whether something occurred in the past, the present, or the future. So in English, if we say the sentence, she walked, you know that walk has to be a verb because it occurs with that past tense affix ed. You can't put ed on a noun, for example. She rabbited, right? I don't know what that means, right? Rabbit is a noun. It can't occur with the tense marker ed. So again, just lending credence to this idea that you can figure out the part of speech based on the affixes that are allowed to attach to a word. Similarly, aspect. Aspect tells you whether the action is habitual, whether it's completed, already done, or whether it's ongoing. So in the English phrase or sentence, she is walking, that is with the ing morpheme at the end tells you that the process of walking is ongoing. It's happening as we speak. It's not completed yet. She's still on her walk. So again, a clue that walk must be a verb and not a noun or some other part of speech. So here's a handy little mnemonic for you. If you're not sure of the category of a word in your language, do a quick little test, right? If it can appear with a determiner, so the something, it's probably a noun. If it can occur with a tense or aspect marker like will, meaning something's going to happen in the future, it's probably a verb. If you can modify it, right? If you can make it so that you're expressing more intensity using, let's say, the word very, probably an adjective. If it expresses a spatial relation, probably some sort of preposition, postposition. So you're doing some detective work here. You're trying to look around at the surroundings, at the friends of a particular word in order to suss out its role in the sentence. Another thing we think about a lot when we're looking into the syntax of a language is word order, right? This is actually really one of the first things that a linguist will assess or establish when they're working on a language. And this just means, how does a language arrange these three things: the subject of the sentence, the verb in the sentence, and if there is one, the object of the sentence. So in my example sentence, the dog chased the cat. That's a lovely grammatical English sentence. The subject, the dog, is first, followed by the verb chased, followed by the thing being chased, the cat, the object. So English is what we call an SVO language. It's not as simple as saying that, oh, this language is an SVO language, because sometimes it does vary. For example, in English, if we were to ask the question, did the dog chase the cat, right? We suddenly added that little did at the front. So some languages allow for more flexibility with their word order. And in some languages, word order depends on the context or the type of sentence that you're trying to construct. I find linguistic typology to be very interesting. Typology is the study of sort of comparing lots of languages of the world and their various properties. So here is a typological chart I found for you about word order. So it tells you across the world's languages, which word orders are the most common. So we identified English as being SVO, and that's the second most common word order throughout the world's languages. The first most common is SOV. So languages that state the subject, then they state the object, then they state the verb. And you can kind of go through all 6 possibilities. All the way down at the bottom here is OSV, very, very rare word order. And typologists love this kind of stuff because they really love to be able to make inferences about the human brain by sort of examining a wide distribution of the world's languages. Why is it that humans are less inclined to think about the object first in a sentence, right? What does that tell us cognitively about how we process language? But of course, there's an example that can be found for almost anything. So languages are pretty remarkable that way. So here are some examples of different languages with different word orders. So this is also provides a few more instances of glossing conventions and how that would work. So in French, we've got the quick brown fox occurring first. In French, it's rendered as the fast fox brown. And then you've got your verb jumps, and then over the dog lazy in French. So collectively, you've got your subject, the fox, jumps, the verb, over the dog, the object. So French is a good old SVO language, just like English. But if we move down to something like Japanese, for example, we're going to find our glossing is a little bit different, right? Again, we see the quick brown fox at the beginning. So that's our S. But then the object appears next, right? The lazy dog. So we've got an SOV language ending with the verb. And just pause for a moment to kind of appreciate the morphological glossing that we have here. Notice that this ga morpheme in Japanese, which is attached to fox, tells us that it's the subject of the sentence. This o morpheme attached to dog tells us it's the object of the sentence. That's what accusative and nominative are telling us. And you can see others in Marathi, for example. You can see morphemes that express it's present, it's singular, it's masculine. So morphemes are doing a lot of the heavy lifting in some of these languages in terms of what they convey. As you are progressing with your language documentation project, you might be interested in exploring different types of sentences and phrases. Types of sentences, there are many, but some of the basic ones are existential, to say that there is something exists. They can also be declarative, which are statements of fact. The child is sleeping, the child broke the bowl, right? Those things are factually accurate. Yes, no questions. We also refer to these as polar questions, which are things like, is the child sleeping? Did the child break the bowl? And they can be answered with a yes or a no. And then WH questions, which are questions that involve the use of a so-called question word. In English, these words are things like who, what, where, why, when. And because in English, they happen to all start with WH, we tend to refer to these questions as WH questions in linguistics. So any question in any language that uses a question word. So you'll want to work with speakers of the language to kind of figure out how each of these sentence types is rendered. Phrases as well. We've got prepositional phrases on the desk. We've got noun phrases such as bright red backpack, possessive noun phrases, my backpack. And in different languages, these may all call for different word orders. So that's another sort of thing that you'll have to assess as you move through your documentation process. So just to kind of leave you with a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of starting thoughts as you launch your documentation work, things to think about are, what's the word order of a basic sentence in your language? What about a non-basic sentence? What about a question? Can you identify some of the affixes that occur in your language? In English, we have the S affix, which makes things plural and makes verbs present tense. What are those similar affixes in your languages? Are there any morphological processes that you can observe, like reduplication? Do you have prepositions or do you have postpositions in your language? That's an interesting one. Some languages like Hindi have postpositions where instead of saying on the box, you would say the box on, for example. Your determiners and your adjectives, do they come before or after nouns? How does your language deal with verbs? How do you assign tense and aspect to verbs and describe when a verb or an action happened in time? How do you invert a statement so that it becomes a question? So these are all kind of, things that should be on your mind as you're beginning to document your language. And this is going to expand rapidly. The more questions you answer, the more questions you will generate. And that's why you keep collecting data. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a little template that I've created in the hopes of just sort of jump-starting some of these documentation questions. So let me just make sure I can find the template. If you'll pardon me for a second. Seems to have disappeared, but I will retrieve it. One moment. Okay, here it is. Apologies for this. Let's see. Oh, I'm having computer troubles. My goodness. Okay. Share screen. Here we go. All right. That should hopefully show you the morphology and syntax elicitation template. So you might want to start with something like this, or generate this yourself, right? If you're sitting with a speaker of a language, you could very easily sit down and say, hey, how do you say I, right? Just the very basic first person singular pronoun in your language. And this is going to generate a lot of richness, right? Because a lot of languages have different layers of complexity and layers of meaning that they capture in their pronouns. So for example, some languages have an inclusive versus exclusive distinction between we, which means when I say we, am I including the person that is listening, or am I excluding them? Some languages have a dual instead of a plural, right? So you can make a differentiation between when there are two things or when there are more than two things. That can be a grammatical distinction in a language. So you're going to want to start to be attuned to some of these subtleties in your language. And then you might start to elicit different sentences that involve these different pronouns. And you'll see how your language changes in response to those different actors. So I read, the verb read may look very different from the verb for you read. In English, they happen to look identical. In some other languages, they might be very different. And by comparing these different forms, you'll be able to identify, hey, what changed? And the thing that changed is most likely an affix of some sort. And then you can start kind of piecing together, solving the puzzle of what meaning does that affix convey? Why did adding that little thing, that prefix or suffix or circumfix, why did that change the meaning of my sentence? And can I use that affix to change the meaning in other sentences as well? So you might want to try something similar for prepositional phrases, right? See whether the prepositions appear before or after the noun that they describe, in which case they're postpositions. Noun phrases could be very interesting, right? You might want to elicit different possessive noun phrases, throw in some adjectives there, see what changes, right? Maybe the addition of a plural marker, right, could change the entire phrase. And so you want to be able to figure those things out. So keep tweaking the translations until you've kind of isolated each unit of meaning, each morpheme, and the role that it plays. Tense and aspect for verbs, you might want to say, all right, the boy eats the apple, he is eating the apple, he ate the apple, all these different shades of meaning that can be represented. And see how they're represented in your language, what morphemes or what syntactic structure actually goes into the generation of meaning in your language. Figure out the difference between questions and statements in your language, right? So this is just a starting point, a way to systematically elicit different sentences that vary in just one aspect, right? Because that's our goal, is to very scientifically approach this, to isolate a single grammatical aspect, identify the morpheme that it corresponds to, and then you start to generate a description of your language and the syntax and morphology of that language, and you start creating a roadmap for how to move forward. That's all I have for syntax and morphology, but hopefully it gave you some ideas about how to begin probing these features of the language that you're interested in, and I'm more than happy to answer questions.
All right. Thanks, Olivia. Wonderful presentation. I have dropped some questions from the chat in a message to you.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. Oh yes, mood. I didn't talk about mood. So tense, aspect, and mood are features of verbs, and mood is a good one. So it refers to sort of, how would I say this? If you have, for example, the subjunctive versus the indicative mood, some languages make that distinction. The subjunctive mood will represent that the thing you're saying, the statement you're making, is not necessarily a statement of fact. It is instead hypothetical or a wish or a counterfactual. So there's different degrees of certainty associated with the verb or with the sentence. Anna, can you explain it better than I just did? I was caught off guard by mood.
Yeah, I think mood often has to do with the relationship between a thing and reality. Kind of like Olivia said, subjunctive is like, this could happen. Or indicative is like, this is real, this happened, or it's real. Yeah, mood's a complicated one.
Yeah. But it's a very important one. I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you. In addition to tense and aspect, that's another sort of feature of verbs and what they're able to convey. Another great question: is there an existing questionnaire used in the field to collect data for morphosyntactic investigation? There are so many, actually, and you can find these in a lot of papers, a lot of online resources. The trouble is that there are actually so many, and they're not particularly well collated. So you might have to do a little bit of digging, but there are definitely places where you can find at least a starting set of questions to get you thinking about the possibilities in your language. And maybe Anna has some good resources to point you to. I can drop some in the chat as well, some that I am aware of. Okay. Software for glossing. So we described the Leipzig glossing conventions. Are there free glossing softwares? So this question asker mentions Elan and Flex and Prot, which are all very powerful linguistic tools. In terms of glossing, I always use very nerdily LaTeX to do my glossing. I know some people will just paste it into a Word document, so to speak. Anna, what do you do when you're glossing?
I use tables in a Word document. It's not
Yeah,
very high tech. There are
yeah.
better ways, but
I'm not
it
aware of any
works.
softwares specifically devoted to glossing, but if there aren't, there should be. So someone out there in the audience who knows things about building software should get on that. That would be a high demand tool for sure. And then, haha, I see some comments on my sort of throwaway comment about languages without nouns. This is coming from a syntax textbook, which I have right behind me, so I can go grab it and find the evidence. But the idea is that even things like nouns are actually expressed verbally. So instead of saying the soldier, it would be translated something as like the fighting one. And I'm not going to do a good job of explaining it, but perhaps while Anna's answering some questions, I can go grab that book and give you the citation because it is very interesting.
I see a few more questions in the chat. So we have a question, how to proceed when looking at how negation is expressed in an agglutinating language. Any suggestions, Olivia?
Oh my goodness. That is a great one. Well, agglutinating languages are nice in a way because they have that one-to-one mapping of morpheme to meaning, right? So the hope is that if you are eliciting a bunch of sentences in your language, and then you elicit the negations of those sentences, the hope is that you should be able to identify exactly one thing that has changed, like one additional morpheme that has appeared in those negative sentences, so that you can say, aha, yes, that is the morpheme that tells me it's been negated. Obviously, life is never that lovely or simple, right? So things might be more complicated than that. But the idea with all of this elicitation is really to try to isolate variables. So try to elicit sequences of sentences that vary by just one feature. And then by honing in on what has changed in going from A to B, you should start to craft or cultivate a hypothesis as to what it is that how to render that unit of meaning. So that would be my advice, not just for agglutinating languages, but for all languages if you're trying to figure out the negation morphology or syntax. And it's a process, and it's certainly not as with any science, not cut and dry. But the more data you collect, the better your model of how to create meaning.
Right, we got another great question. What literature do you recommend to study morphology and syntax in all languages or to describe languages? Because often what happens in Spanish when we learn morphology, it focuses only on Spanish.
Yeah, it's so true. And I find that it's funny, only when I started learning other languages did I feel like I had any understanding of my own language, my first language, English, right? Because once you start picking apart and dissecting the grammar of other languages, you start thinking about how your language does that. And it gives you lots more insights. So I do have some morphology textbooks that I can and syntax textbooks I can recommend. I can pop those names in the chat and email them out later. But to your point, I think studying other languages is a wonderful way to appreciate the diversity of ways that languages have to express things. And it's, I'm still constantly stumbling over things that I had no idea a language could do. And yet somehow there's a language that does it. So in order to really appreciate the breadth of possibility, exposure to different languages is key. But I'll certainly recommend some textbooks as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Olivia. I see another great question. Do you think only linguists are able to do language documentation, or can anybody do this task?
I am so glad you asked this question because it is my firm belief that anybody can do this. That is sort of the whole point behind these sort of training webinars is that you don't need to be a linguist and have spent years studying the intricacies of theoretical syntax in order to perform this sort of analysis, right? You now are equipped with just on the basis of a 45-minute presentation, you know enough to really start exploring your language and noting down what it does in particular instances. So yeah, that's my whole philosophy, is that no linguistics degree required to do any of this sort of work. You just need a little bit of context, a little bit of just seeing how it's done, and then you're off to the races. And that's how it should be, I think. I think especially when working with vulnerable languages or endangered languages, it's so important that it not just be a linguist that kind of swoops in and helps with the documentation. They should help, of course, if they can. But language is such a deeply personal thing that I think empowering folks to perform this sort of work on their own language is a really powerful and exciting prospect, in my opinion. So yeah. Thank you for that question.
Hear, hear. And I've got one more question here in the chat. Can loose sentences also be classified as ungrammatical sentences? I'm curious what you mean by loose sentence, Kamal, if you want to put some more context in the chat. Then maybe while we're waiting for a little more info there, I have a great question. Do you know about any large-scale comparative typological studies that compare, say, 50 to 100 languages?
Oh, there are so many. This is a great question. And it really depends on what you're interested in knowing, right? There's typological studies across all fields of linguistics. One of my professors is a phonology typologist. So she looks at sound systems in the world's languages and which sounds are the most common, right? What if you only have 5 vowels in your language, what 5 vowels are they most likely to be? So you can think about that. Yes. Oh, Anna, amazing. WALS. WALS is definitely the place to go. It is a website that looks at the syntactic structures of different languages throughout the world, and you can go ahead and compare and sort of see broader trends. That is a really fun website if you want to kill an entire weekend and just go down that rabbit hole. And I would highly recommend it. But yeah, there's typological studies are a huge part of what linguistics do, or what a certain subset of linguists do. So please, yeah, keep exploring and let me know if I can help direct you to any particular research.
Yeah. Well, any other questions? Well, if we're maybe waiting on a little bit more info on what a loose sentence might mean, I have some guesses. What do you think a loose sentence might describe, Olivia?
Well, I was thinking maybe a sentence that is not a full sentence, for example, something that is just a phrase that stands on its own. So your English grammar teachers in 5th grade would tell you that is ungrammatical, but linguists think about grammaticality very differently than perhaps your English teachers growing up, because what's grammatical, according to a linguist, is just something that a speaker of that language would say. That feels comfortable to say in the language, that feels intelligible. And so if you ask me, hey, where's the cat? And I say, in the kitchen, right? In the kitchen is not technically a full sentence, right? So I guess it's not grammatical by that standard, but you understood perfectly what I said. It was a perfect, perfectly formulated piece of English. It conveyed the correct meaning in the correct way, in the correct order. And so in the kitchen is a fully grammatical phrase. And so I think maybe that's what you mean by loose sentence. What would you say, Anna?
Yeah, that's a good guess. And I think my only other guess might be an ambiguous sentence, right? A sentence that could have multiple meanings.
True.
And those can definitely be grammatical, right? People need to be ambiguous sometimes, maybe to be polite or to be secretive or just for other reasons. And those can be totally grammatical sentences too. So Yeah, I'm also very interested in the ways people describe language without using this like linguist terminology, like, what we call
Absolutely.
folk linguistics, but is really just like, how do other people think about language? And I've never come across this phrase, a loose sentence. So I'm very
Yeah.
interested in learning more. Please write to us, Kamal, if you have more thoughts.
I really appreciate someone put in the chat the prescriptivist versus descriptivist distinction, right? And so as linguists, we strive always to be descriptivist. We describe what we see and what we hear without assigning any value judgments to it, right? Whereas maybe I'm thinking in particular, my fifth grade teacher would give me a big red X on my paper if I did something that wasn't perfect according to her definition of English grammar. That's a very prescriptivist notion that there are good and there are bad ways of speaking. But linguists are descriptivist. There's no good or bad way. There's just the way that somebody speaks, and we're all about the data, and we're all about just everyday use of language. It's a great distinction to draw.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Oh, yep, there they are. Got two more. So, where classifiers fit into morphology?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a really good one. Um, Anna, do you have any thoughts? I can sort of try to collect my thoughts around that.
Oh,
But
I've never worked with languages that had classifiers
fair
other than
enough.
noun classes.
Yeah, that's
So
same. I've worked with languages that will have classifier morphemes for, like, is a thing long and skinny, or is it, curved like an umbrella handle, right? Those types of classifiers I'm thinking of in Mandarin specifically. But I haven't worked a whole lot with classifier systems. But they would
yeah,
definitely be considered uh, morphemes, inflectional morphemes of some sort, that fit in with determiners and adjectives. Wish I had a better answer.
and I think it really depends on the language, right? Some
Yeah,
languages will treat their classifiers in different ways. Sometimes they will be an affix, sometimes it will be a separate root word that describes something about another
yeah.
word. So if you have specific questions about your language, please feel free to write to Olivia and we can go a
Yes.
little deeper about that.
And if I can't answer the question, I can connect you to someone who can. There's so many experts out there. I'd be
Hmm,
happy to make those connections.
yeah.
Um,
One more great question. How can we explain the descriptivist view to people? I've got a science communication question
I
here.
know that's a really tough one, because the prescriptivist viewpoint is very deeply entrenched, right? That's what you're taught in schools. People tend to be very protective of language in some ways, right? People tend to be hesitant to embrace language change. If you're watching social media, language changes so fast, and I look at the language that the kids these days use, and it's almost unintelligible to the language I was using when I was a teenager, and that can be a little bit of a scary phenomenon. But that's just completely natural, right? Language change is utterly natural. And the ways people use language are creative, and not necessarily subject to rules. So you kind of need to embrace language as an art and not just as a science, and to embrace the fact that it is going to change constantly, and what people consider to be grammatical language changes. And really, what should define grammaticality is usage, and not sort of a textbook telling you what is and what isn't right. Yeah, I don't know if that sort of helps with the communication part of it, but definitely just emphasizing that what you want as a linguist to what you want to do is describe what's really, how language is really being used by real people. That's the most important thing to capture, as with any other science, right? In physics, you want to describe how particles are interacting. You don't want to impose your ideas of how they should interact. Same with language, just describe what you're hearing, right? Without thoughts of, oh, this is good or this is bad.
Yes, all right. We have one more kind of technical question. Is it possible to describe an existential with dynamic verbs as opposed to auxiliaries in English?
Hmm. um, let's see if I can come up with a good answer to that one. So you mean like there is a cat over there, right? With dynamic verbs, like a cat exists over there. the cat sits over there sort of has kind of an existential semantic quality. Is that kind of what you're saying? That instead of like a copula, you're using like a more substantive verb. Yeah, you definitely can
exactly.
do that.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm asking. So
Yeah.
in many Tibeto-Burman languages, the one that I speak, so we express existential with the help of some like verb like leave or stay or I, or some sort
Absolutely.
of example. Yeah, yeah. As opposed to auxiliary, that kind. Okay.
That's absolutely,
Thanks.
no, that's a great question. And yeah, you can do that in English. You can do that.
It feels a little awkward. I think we can say things like, there exists in this world a cat.
Yeah, it's a little, it's perhaps not as, doesn't come as naturally as it might in one of the Tibeto-Burman languages that you're mentioning. We do tend to use the to be verb as our existential verb most often. Yeah, I think you're right, Anna. I think it's a gray area. Hey, it's a descriptive area, not a prescriptive one.
Indeed. Right, we got another question from Elwin. Do you have some advice to document a documented language? Because sometimes a documented language and its data is not reproducible or used at all. So it would be nice to have some standards or interoperable formats.
Oh, and you just hit upon a question that linguists and documentary linguists are talking about and thinking about all the time, which is that there are a lot of efforts underway to document languages, but they don't necessarily interface with one another, right? Or different softwares are not interoperable. There's these different threads of documentation that are happening that aren't necessarily communicating. And this is like a problem in the field in general, I think. And I think it's excellent that you recognize that. Yeah, I mean, in terms of languages that have already been documented, I think it's important to do your due diligence in terms of seeing what is out there in terms of existing documentation materials, not to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. But certainly there are always gaps to be filled. So no, I don't think any language can ever be considered truly documented. There are still research papers coming out about English all the time, right? So there's always more to be learned and discussed. But yeah, I think if we as collectively, as society, as linguists, as people, language advocates, can try to come up with some more standard protocols for performing language documentation, that would make it a lot easier for people to collaborate. And so, Elwin, I'm totally with you. Wish I had a better answer, but it's something we talk about all the time at the University of Hawaii. So hopefully change is in the wind.
Yeah, and there was a lot published on this topic in like I want to say the early 2000s, early 2010s, especially around creating standards for interoperability of language data
Yes.
on a large scale. So I will drop some of those papers in the Google Drive folder too, because it's a very technical topic, maybe not interesting to everybody, but very interesting to some people. So I'll share those papers. Oh my gosh, so many more questions. Let's see. How would you go about getting to the rarer parts of the morphology? Like in Donnie, ergativity is only used in situations that are culturally unusual.
That's a really good question. So this, Nick, kind of gets at another sort of little debate that occurs between linguists. So some linguists are really like to not do what we call elicitation. So elicitation is when I say to you, like, hey, tell me how to say I ate an apple in your language. Some linguists prefer these sentences to arise organically over the course of just natural conversation freely. And I think that is really valuable because what you're getting there is entirely organic language data as to how things would be described in the language. When you elicit something, you do run the risk of having it sound a little clunky in that language because you're sort of using your language and trying to ask for a translation. So you're starting from an existing from another language, basically. However, elicitation is crucial when it comes to what you've just described here, which are rare patterns in the language that you could sit with a community for hundreds and hundreds of hours having natural free-flowing conversation, and that ergative marker might never show up just because it's unusual in the language. So you as a linguist kind of have to have a sense of the things that languages can do so that you can start asking some questions, some very targeted questions, and see if you can elicit ergative markers or absolutive markers, or try to figure out the alignment system. This is like what do I want to say? A kind of a level up from your basic documentary linguistics. This is getting pretty in the weeds, but yeah, elicitation is a very, very valuable tool to try to identify some of those subtler, less common phenomena in languages.
Right, I see one more question. Do you have any recommendations for voice recorders? A perpetual question.
Yes.
What hardware do you use?
Zoom or Tascam voice recorders are excellent. Honestly, though, your cell phone with an external microphone might be the cheapest, easiest, and best option, because cell phone technology has gotten so amazing these days that it's actually kind of outstripped the really fancy, expensive stuff that you can get at Radio Shack or whatever. So your cell phone's pretty powerful. And can be rendered even more powerful if you find an external microphone that attaches to it, which are pretty cheap, maybe about $50. But the brands I just recommended are Zoom and Tascam. Goes down.
And there's actually, I believe there is a new product coming out from Shure, the microphone company, coming
really?
out early next year.
Yeah, okay.
I've heard rumors, so keep an eye out. We'll share about that when it comes out. But it's supposed to be sort of an easy all-in-one mic and audio recorder package.
That'd be really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, just looking for any other questions in the chat. Or feel free to hop on mic or video if you want to ask in person. But if we don't have any other questions, Olivia, as usual, are you? Oh, yes. Hi.
Hi, thank you. This is Bruce Sinicho.
Hi, Bruce.
Sinicho, a big thank you from Upper Canada, Alaska. I just had one question about dialects in the language. It's kind of hard trying to teach, just one language, but then there's like 2 or 3 different dialects in the same language. I guess trying to figure out easier way to try to honor all of them and make them all available. I guess it's just more work to go through, but it's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bruce. That's a really awesome question, because I think a lot of communities think about this. How do you honor every dialect, every speaker, right? And there's going to be so much variation in any language. And if you're working on a documentation project, you don't want to legitimize one variety at the cost of the others, to sort of say by producing this dictionary, I have now said that dialect A is the official dialect, right? So there can be some danger associated with that. It's a really hard question that people are still grappling with. I think your instinct to honor the variation is a really good one. It obviously makes the project a lot harder and a lot longer. But doing things that dialect dictionaries, for example, where you have a word that you then translate into multiple dialects, so that a user of that dictionary can sort of see that variation. Yeah, I mean, the scope of the project expands significantly, but I think the benefits of honoring all that variety is really valuable. Anna, would you have anything to add there? Any advice?
Yeah. I mean, especially in the classroom setting, if you've got students who are from multiple dialects, I think a really nice activity to do early on in a class is to teach people to recognize the patterns that show up across dialects, right? Like, a lot of people will catch on really quick if they're like, oh, our S is a th for you guys. And so if someone else is using another dialect in the classroom, once people start to recognize the patterns that differentiate those dialects, they won't have any trouble really understanding each other, because it's pretty simple for your brain just to be like, oh yeah, our s is your th. So when you say th, I know how to sort of translate that in my brain. And so doing that sort of critical awareness raising together early on in a class where you just look at the patterns and identify them together, and then just teach all the dialects, right? And then people can make those conversions into their own dialect in their own head. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but that's one suggestion. Another way would be when you're doing the documentation work, do it with the goal of documenting all of the variation that's out there. And I will share some really cool projects that sort of map how things are pronounced in different parts of a territory. There's a really nice one out there for Irish, actually, where you can like click on different points of a map of Ireland and hear how different Irish words are pronounced in those places. So yeah, lots of great resources out there on honoring different dialects, and I will drop some in the Google Drive folder.
Yeah, it's such an important question, and one that crops up all the time. This is a really common difficulty. Yeah. And share, I see someone mentions, Laura, sharing of resources. Gail as well says, yeah, that this sort of collaborative efforts, goes without saying, but makes that very daunting project more tractable, right? As you can tackle little pieces together.
Yeah, and involving all the different dialects also will encourage people to get involved in your documentation project, right? You can, I don't know how I feel about the term crowdsourcing, but you really can crowdsource a lot of documentation. Put out a call like, I want to know how this word is said where you are. Send in your recordings to me. And you can make a map of all the different ways people say a word across your whole territory. It could be really cool and get folks engaged and involved because their dialect is represented there.
That's true. As a kind of a identity and a validation of your identity thing, seeing all the dialects represented is really important. Yeah.
Right. Do we have any last questions? Oh gosh, sorry, Olivia, we've kept you quite over time. Thanks for being here so long.
Yeah. Anna, some of the questions that require me to go dig a little deeper for some references, I will send you what I find, and maybe you can disseminate that to the wider group. And
Perfect.
I'm always happy. I'll throw my email in the chat. And I'll share my slides. But please do reach out to me. If I can't answer your question, I'll find a person who can.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Olivia. This was a great presentation as always. And next week, we're going to be shifting focus a little bit. So stepping away from some of the sounds and grammar stuff to look broader at the context of a language. And Ha'alilu Solomon from University of Hawaii is going to be teaching a session on documenting biocultural knowledge, all of that knowledge baked into a language about the world around us. So tune in next week. It's going to be a great session, and we'll send out the slides and other resources. And as always, hope everybody has a great weekend. Happy Halloween if you celebrate. Stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.